Jen Mann, the author of the book People I Want to Punch in the Throat, Competitive Crafters, Drop-Off Despots, and Other Suburban Scourges, writes about the quintessential bit of Americana tradition that is a garage sale. She reveals to her audience that besides shopping at garage sales, I love hosting garage sales. Every year, my mom and I dig through our houses and find a bunch of crap, really terrific stuff, to sell so that we can earn more money so we can go back out and buy some more crap. Really terrific stuff that we'll use for a bit and then turn around and garage sale in a couple of years. It's the circle of life, suburban style. The garage sale tradition began in the early 1800s, with shipping yards selling their unclaimed cargo and leftover warehouse items at a steep discount. Because the freight could contain literally anything, the term rummage sale became attached to the practice that left thousands poking around for a good deal. Churches picked up on the tradition by the late 1800s, inviting members from the community to take part in a once-a-year bazaar. Homeowners took over the practice in the 1950s during the period of post-World War II economic expansion as America's industries transformed themselves from the arsenal of democracy into the drivers of capitalist expansion. After suffering through half of a decade of war rationing, Americans often spent with reckless abandonment, swiping up new cars and affordable houses which were literally ordered from the catalogs of Sears. The History Channel points out that new home buyers needed appliances to fill those homes, and companies like Frigidaire, a division of General Motors, responded to that need. During the war, Frigidaire's assembly lines had transitioned to building machine guns and B-29 propeller assemblies. After the war, the brand expanded its home appliance business, including revolutionary products like clothes washers and dryers, dishwashers, and garbage disposals. PBS's American Experience tells us that after World War II, consumer spending no longer meant just satisfying an indulgent material desire. In fact, the American consumer was praised as an example of what it meant to be a patriotic citizen in the 1950s, one who directly contributes to the ultimate success of the American way of life. The good purchaser devoted to more, newer, and better was the good citizen, historian Elizabeth Cohen explains. Since economic recovery after a decade and a half of depression and war depended on a dynamic mass consumption economy. Thus, it became trendy for consumers to express the phrase, "out with the old, in with the new," by hoisting all of their former prized possessions onto their lawns so that their neighbors could rummage around for a good deal. In the immediate years before World War II, the Germans were having their own sort of garage sale, offering neighboring countries the chance to pick up an incredible bargain basement deal on some of the world's elite scientists. The mass exodus of Germany's intellectual elites was comprised of pacifists, leftists, females, and Jews. A year after Hitler's rise, his Minister of Education asked Göttingen University's best mathematician whether it was true that his institute had suffered so much from the departure of the Jews and their friends. The professor responded back that the institution hadn't suffered. Instead, it had just ceased to exist without them. One unnamed Berlin scientist stated that what we are now doing in Germany is organizing a bargain sale of good merchandise at reduced prices. Shrewd persons will certainly seize this opportunity to buy something from us. Historians Jean Medawar and David Pike's work entitled Hitler's Gift, Scientists Who Fled Nazi Germany, reveals to us that William Beveridge, the director of the London School of Economics, immediately pulled up to sample the wares that had been unceremoniously thrown out for all to see. He formed an academic assistants council in a brazen attempt to draw Germany's best minds to England. He was soon competing with Frederick Lindemann, who went on a shopping trip in his chauffeur-driven Rolls-Royce to Germany to personally recruit. Not to be outdone, the American Rockefeller Foundation soon found their way across the Atlantic for the sale of the century. Proving that one man's trash is another man's treasure, the effects of the exodus were transformative for everyone involved, with the buyers reaping all of the benefits. Nobel laureate Peter Medawar was once asked to name the 3 greatest Englishmen he knew. He named an art historian, a biologist, and a philosopher, all of whom had escaped Vienna, Austria. Biologists Wilhelm Friedberg, Hans Krebs, Ernst Chain, and Max Perutz went to their new homes and greatly contributed to medical science. But the greatest finds in Germany's garage sale were the Jewish physicists who would go on to build the atomic bomb for America. And foremost among that distinguished group was Albert Einstein, the man whom Germany had not yet hanged. The Nazis promised the German people a Third Reich, a government that would remain in place for the next 1,000 years. But by chasing away many of their best and brightest minds, they unknowingly sowed the seeds for the rise of the new liberal order. You're listening to Empires, Anarchy, and Other Notable Moments, a podcast designed for deep dives that assist in the teaching of history. This series is about the man who remains synonymous with the term genius, Albert Einstein. Episode number 5, Einstein at War. Upon taking up residence in England, Albert Einstein became a vocal critic of the new dictator who had taken up residence in his homeland. He had to first grapple with his steadfast belief in pacifism, however. The physicist had done his very best to ignore World War I while working on the behalf of a German government agency which had increasingly devoted the work of its employees towards military victory. After the war, Einstein presented himself as the face of the international movement of pacifism, ruffling the feathers of the Western victors at the disarmament conference by promoting his theoretical idea that 2% of the population acting as conscientious objectors would end the practice of war permanently. Historian Ronald Clark writes that Einstein's rejection of the pacifist cause did not come suddenly. The first hints of a change in his all-out pacifist beliefs came in November of 1932, when shortly before leaving Berlin for the United States, he issued a statement on certain disarmament proposals put forward. Included in these was one for an international police force, and Einstein agreed that this should be armed with and would presumably be allowed to use truly effective weapons. In his mind, the credible threat of violence was necessary in order to prevent the threat of actual violence. Hitler, however, was such a clear and present danger to the peaceful international order that the physicist proclaimed that were I a Belgian, I should not, in the present circumstances, refuse military service. Rather, I should enter such service cheerfully in the belief that I would thereby be helping to save European civilization. Clark notes that for a long time he had encouraged pacifism. Now he decided that every sword that is drawn against Germany is a sword of peace. He first attempted to fight back by serving on the World Committee for the Victims of German Fascism. That group published the Brown Book of the Hitler Terror. It was the first document with evidence that attempted to prove that the Nazis themselves had instigated the burning of the Reichstag. The actual answer to that question remains unknown, but whether or not they had instigated it, the Nazis had effectively used the act of arson to legitimize their dictatorship. In response, the German government placed a bounty of $5,000 upon Einstein's head, which caused him to casually touch his messy white hair and remark, "I didn't know it was worth so much." The group's report was explosive. Historian Andrew Wackerfuss of Georgetown claimed in 2015 that the popularity of the Brown Book of Hitler Terror was rooted in the fact that Reichstag conspiracy appealed to anti-fascists because of their pre-existing belief that the heart of the Nazis' militant nationalist politics lay in the sinister schemes of decadent homosexual criminals. Sensationalized stories about Einstein's escape to England quickly were picked up by the press. Although the renowned physicist was supposedly hiding for his life, his host, an anti-fascist parliament member named Oliver Locker-Lampson, invited journalists for interviews as well as to allow an artist access in order to complete a sculpture of Einstein's famous noggin. The Netflix docufilm Einstein and the Bomb utilizes this rustic English hideaway as its main setting. Although they depict Albert as being guarded around the clock by two eager women, the real story is far less sensational, as the girls served as Locker-Lampson's secretary. They and the local farmhand carried sporting rifles, but according to Clark, it was done partly as a joke and partly as local color for photographers. The historian discounts the supposed threats, writing that there is no need to believe that this particular assassination would have been beyond the infamy of the Nazis, and their record suggests that it would not have been beyond their stupidity. But Einstein himself had the most common sense comment, stating that when a bandit is going to commit a crime, he keeps it a secret. The former German strongly hinted at a desire to become a British citizen, supporting his host's efforts at passing emergency legislation which would see England permanently take in a large number of scientists turned refugees. His stay in Great Britain culminated in a speech to the sold-out 10,000-seat Albert Hall. It was designed to clearly spell out the threat of the German menace. It's important to note that in 1933, Hitler had yet to reveal his full diabolical hand to the international order. In 1936, the Führer showed off for the cameras as host of the Berlin Olympics. Einstein's address 3 years earlier is an excellent example of speech writing, for the physicist let his audience read between the lines so that he didn't further provoke the German state, which had gone on the record warning Einstein against further poking the German bear. Some of my favorite lines from the speech include, "Let us hope that a historian delivering judgment in some future period when Europe is politically and economically united will be able to say that in our days the liberty and honor of this continent was saved by its Western nations, which stood fast in hard times against the temptations of hatred and oppression." He also stated that, in such periods discontent breeds hatred, and hatred leads to acts of violence and revolution, and often even to war. Thus, distress and evil produce new distress and new evil. Finally, he called for action, telling the audience that in the lightning flashes of our tempestuous times, one sees human beings and things in their nakedness. Every action and every human being reveal clearly their aims, powers, and weaknesses, but also their passions. After a standing ovation, Albert remarked to a British journalist that I could not believe that it was possible that such spontaneous affection could be extended to one who is a wanderer on the face of the earth. The kindness of your people has touched my heart so deeply that I cannot find words to express in English what I feel. I shall leave England for America at the end of the week, but no matter how long I live, I shall never forget the kindness which I have received from the people of England. Shortly afterwards, he crossed the Atlantic for America. He would never again set foot in Europe. Upon his arrival to the newly formed Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, he implored his driver to stop for an ice cream cone. Jersey wasn't exactly an in-demand location for the world's greatest minds. When the Hungarian pathologist Janos Plech was informed of Einstein's employment plans, he playfully inquired whether his friend wanted to commit suicide. Clark explains the allure that Princeton posed for Einstein, noting that the atmosphere of the institute itself had its attractions. There were no undergraduates, no fraternities, no football teams, no grants, no degrees. Instead, there was an intellectual monasticism which allowed him and other scholars who already included among refugees from Germany Erwin Panofsky, Ernst Herzfeld, and Dr. Otto Nathan, who became Einstein's friend and literary executor, to get on with their thoughts without interruption. His small home was just a few hundred yards from the campus. Although he typically walked everywhere, there was one instance early on when Albert was figuring out American coins while attempting to ride the bus. After causing a long delay, he apologized to the driver by stating, "Bad at arithmetic." Jersey also isolated him from the pesky American press, which had initially soured the physicists on the entire country. Now that he was planning to live here for at least 6 months out of the year, Albert began to worry about the negative effects of American consumerism. One of his close friends at Princeton summed up his feelings, stating, "We are slaves of bathrooms, refrigerators, cars, radios, and a million of other things." Einstein was prepared for this fight, as his wife reveals that he tried to reduce the need for stuff to the absolute minimum. Long hair minimizes the need for the barber. Socks can be done without. One leather jacket solves the coat problem for many years. Suspenders are superfluous, as are nightshirts and pajamas. It is a minimum problem which Einstein has solved, and shoes, trousers, shirt, jacket are the very necessary things. It would be difficult to reduce them further. The physicists would go on to describe Princeton as a wonderful little spot, a quaint and ceremonious village of puny demigods on stilts. After World War II broke out across Europe, he would lament his situation, revealing that "I am almost ashamed to be living in such a place while so many suffer." On February 5, 1934, 5 years before Hitler would invade Poland, Albert and his wife Elsa dined with the Roosevelts in the White House. The conversation went long into the night, in German nonetheless, establishing an initial bond that the physicists would use in order to directly influence the creation of the atomic bomb. By April, he had made the decision to remain at Princeton year-round in order to focus on his efforts at developing his unified field theory. Clark writes that, had Einstein returned to Europe in the spring of 1934, he would have been involved at 2 levels. As a public symbol of opposition to Hitler, he would have had to have spoken, to lobby, to steep himself in the political ferment, an occupation for which he had no liking, even when deeply committed to a cause. Further, there were personal involvements which would inevitably take up his time and his energies. His ex-wife and his 2 sons were safe in Switzerland. His eldest stepdaughter had gone to Amsterdam with her husband, while his youngest had remained in Belgium. There were other relatives, his and Elsa's, scattered across Europe. If he crossed the Atlantic, he would inevitably be drawn more directly into discussion about their future. Rather than cold indifference towards his family, this decision ought to be viewed through the lens that Einstein always prioritized: work. In his life, he put it first, second, and third. His first marriage had failed because his wife, an accomplished physicist herself, couldn't understand or live within this hierarchy. His second attempt at wedded bliss succeeded because Elsa intimately understood her husband/cousin. Clark explains that at the start of their 20 years together, they had achieved a working arrangement. While he devoted himself to discovering how God made the world, she reduced to an absolute minimum the mundane problems of life. He thought while she toiled. Most of their family members that were scattered throughout Nazi-free European land eventually made their way to the United States, the majority of which found their way into the protective orbit of Albert. Unfortunately, Elsa wasn't around to help ease them into their new American lives, as she passed away at the age of 60 on December 20th, 1936, due to complications with her liver and heart. Albert had come to rely upon her so much that it almost felled a mortal blow to the physicist, who was often seen crying publicly in the aftermath. He was a few months shy of 58. A year and a half after she departed, he proclaimed that I wouldn't want to go on living if I didn't have my work. He threw himself into his work world with reckless abandon, writing to his physicist friend Max Born that I have settled down splendidly here. I hibernate like a bear in its cave and really feel more at home than ever before in all my varied existence. This bearishness has been accentuated further by the death of my mate, who was more attached to human beings than I. He was aided in this quest through the establishment of the reputation of a rogue personality among the other professors of Princeton. He proceeded to wage a one-man war against quantum mechanics, declaring it a fad. This was, of course, despite the fact that it was his own discoveries that birthed quantum mechanics into the scientific world. Most of those around him believed that his refusal to give up searching for his unified field theory was akin to Don Quixote bumbling around tilting at windmills. Fellow genius/Princeton resident Robert Oppenheimer said of this time that the years he spent at Princeton, and this, though a source of sorrow, should not be concealed. He had a right to that failure. He spent those years first in trying to prove that the quantum theory had inconsistencies in it. No one could have been more ingenious in thinking up unexpected and clever examples. But it turned out that the inconsistencies were not there, and often their resolution could be found in earlier work of Einstein himself. When that did not work, after repeated efforts, Einstein had simply to say that he did not like the theory. His dogged determination was legendary. Students today are so quick to give up when presented with an obstacle. Einstein, one of the greatest geniuses in human history, spent half of his life failing to articulate a working unified field theory. When asked whether he was nearing his goal, he responded with a curt no, before following up with, "God never tells us in advance whether the course we are to follow is the correct one. At least now I know 99 ways that won't work." He occasionally lectured, but was more often found sitting in the audience for the lectures of his colleagues. At one of these impromptu gatherings, he was again asked whether his formula of E equals mc squared could be utilized to release an unprecedented amount of energy, specifically by bombarding an atom in order to split it. His response was again that such an effort is unlikely to succeed and wasteful to even try. Using a metaphor, he claimed that splitting the atom by bombardment is like shooting at birds in the dark in a region where there are few birds. He didn't know it at the time, but his former colleague Leo Szilard had already filed a secret patent with the British government to do exactly that. By 1938, Adolf Hitler and Germany had shown everyone that they were who the world thought them to be. And by September of 1939, the world was plunged once again into a war for the survival of liberty. As Einstein turned 60, he wrote that the moral decline we are compelled to witness and the suffering it engenders are so oppressive that one cannot ignore them even for a moment. No matter how deeply one immerses oneself in work, a haunting feeling of inescapable tragedy persists. Szilard was close to figuring out the key to a nuclear chain reaction, but the British bureaucracy brushed him aside. Enrico Fermi, another brilliant mind that had been put out in Italy's own fascist rummage sale, managed to split uranium, but misread the results, causing him to falsely believe that he had created a new element rather than beginning a chain reaction. The Aryan German physicists that remained in Berlin, however, saw the reality of what Fermi had done and began their work in 1938 to deliver Germany a weapon of unprecedented power. The nuclear arms race had unofficially begun. The scientific community isn't exactly great at keeping secrets. A worker in the laboratory shared the news with his aunt, who informed Born, who quickly spread the word to the United States that the Germans had replicated Fermi's work. This set off the would-be world powers racing to secure as much uranium as they could. Historian Susan Williams reveals to us that the Democratic Republic of the Congo, a Belgian colony, was the only mine in the world capable of producing the radioactive material needed in order to weaponize Fermi's experiment. Szilard worried that Hitler would soon repeat Germany's playbook from World War I, invading Belgium in an attempt to quickly knock France out of the war. He contacted Albert Einstein to express his concerns that a Nazi-controlled Belgium would be able to monopolize uranium, ending the race for the atomic bomb before it had even begun. Upon his friend's advice, Albert Einstein wrote an infamous letter to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. In the correspondence, he quickly reveals that physicists have opened up Pandora's box by figuring out a possible method for weaponizing uranium. He ominously warns that now it appears almost certain that this could be achieved in the immediate future. He theorized that a single bomb carried by boat might destroy the entire port as well as some of the territory surrounding it. He urged the president to begin securing uranium, particularly from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and set up a fully funded task force bringing the government and leading scientists together in order to advance Fermi's work. It was this letter that began the Manhattan Project beneath the watchful gaze of Robert Oppenheimer. Einstein would later claim that signing the letter had been the greatest mistake of his life. To be sure, most of the scientists working on the Manhattan Project regretted their contribution to the first weapon of mass destruction. Oppenheimer himself famously quipped that I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. Einstein, the greatest living physicist, wasn't invited to join Oppenheimer in Los Alamos due to fears related to his past activism as a left-wing pacifist. J. Edgar Hoover, the controlling and ultra-suspicious leader of the FBI, maintained a comprehensive file on Albert Einstein starting as early as 1932. By the time Einstein passed away in 1955, this dossier had amassed a staggering 1,427 pages. Hoover viewed Einstein's opposition to racism and capitalism as transgressions and suspected Einstein of communist sympathies, labeling him as, at minimum, an extreme radical. Even though he was excluded from it, the 1942 Manhattan Project owed its existence to Einstein ringing the alarm. In his memoirs, Albert claimed that, I do not consider myself the father of the release of atomic energy. my part in it was quite indirect. Still, he would have been fully aware of what was going on. Hundreds of scientists put aside their personal work and traveled to Los Alamos, which was the textbook definition of the middle of nowhere. Simultaneously, the United States began to secure hundreds of tons of uranium. His feelings towards Hitler and the Nazis were well known, a fact which allows us to assume that Albert Einstein was happy that the government had heeded his warning. The atomic bomb in the hands of the Nazis would have allowed Hitler to reach every corner of the planet in his efforts to exterminate Einstein's people. After everything was known, however, he would tell reporters that had I known that the Germans would not succeed in developing their own atomic bomb, I would have done nothing. Einstein also worked with the Roosevelt administration to ensure that scientists weren't publishing the results of their efforts to replicate the work of splitting an atom. For this, he was going against some of his core principles, as scientists regularly rely upon the work of their international colleagues to produce breakthroughs that can then be used by the originator to expand their own work. The danger, of course, was that the published sources were also available in Germany, and thus might unlock a piece of the puzzle for the scientists that had remained loyal to the German state. Because Einstein was on the periphery, I won't dwell too deeply on the Manhattan Project. Clark, however, notes that America would have built the bomb without Einstein, but they might not have had it ready for the war against Japan. Instead, the bomb would have been ready for Korea, by which time, without much doubt, the Russians would have had one too. Einstein's letter in April 1940 setting the U.S. administration along the road towards what was to become the Manhattan Project ended the first phase of this wartime involvement with nuclear weapons. The second, which came a year and a half later, is one of extraordinary irony, for it shows Einstein eager to help the war effort, but kept from it by men unaware that Einstein himself had set the whole U.S. machine moving 2 years earlier. On December 6, 1941, a few hours before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the Office of Scientific Research and Development began a greatly expanded program of research into nuclear weapons. A key technological problem for it was the separation of U-235 from its chemically identical isotopes. While the scientists of Los Alamos had figured out how to set off a chain reaction by separating the atom, they had yet to figure out how to turn the process into a weapon. Faced with a number of theoretical problems, they turned to the world's greatest theoretical physicists. Because of the top-secret nature of their project, they attempted to hide the true nature of the work in vagueness. Einstein, fully aware of what was going on, however, would have known exactly what he was doing when the government approached him. He spent approximately 2 weeks on the problems that the scientists at Oppenheimer's disposal couldn't solve, handing the government operative his handwritten solution on December 19th. They were so fearful of the implications that they weren't willing to let anyone type out his answers for fear of exposing the data to espionage. That led to the hilarious letter sent to Oppenheimer by the operative, stating for the record that Einstein was very much interested in your problem, has worked on it for a couple of days and produced the solution, which I enclose herewith. Einstein asked me to say that if there are other angles of the problem that you want him to develop, or if you wish any parts of this amplified, you need only let him know and he will be glad to do anything in his power. I very much hope that you will make use of him in any way that occurs to you, because I know how deep is his satisfaction at doing anything which might be useful to the national effort. The letter finished with the thought, I hope you can read his handwriting. From the outside looking in, Albert Einstein did what he could to aid the fight against fascism. He wrote letters that were auctioned off for the right cause, gave speeches against the German menace, and labored behind the scenes to aid Jewish resettlement efforts. He also worked for the government via the Navy regarding the theories related to the natural law of underwater explosions. George Gamow was the go-between. He tells us that on every other Friday, I took a morning train to Princeton, carrying a briefcase tightly packed with confidential and secret Navy projects. There was a great variety of proposals, such as exploding a series of underwater mines placed along a parabolic path that would lead to the entrance of a Japanese naval base, with follow-up aerial bombs to be dropped on the flight decks of Japanese aircraft carriers. Einstein would meet me in his study at home, wearing one of his famous soft sweaters, and we would go through all the proposals one by one. He approved practically all of them, saying, "Oh yes, very interesting, very, very ingenious." And the next day, the admiral in charge of the bureau was very happy when I reported to him Einstein's comments. He turned 65 while in service to the war, telling a confidant that so long as the war lasts and I work for the Navy, I do not wish to begin anything else, preferring it that way in light of the amount of work to be done. Einstein, the pacifist, was completely missing during this time, hearkening to a darker version of himself that would claim that the only good German was a dead German. He didn't see this as a contradiction, as he preferred peace. But Hitler wasn't interested in his desires. Thus, the world had to fight back against the violent monster that had been unleashed. This confused many, including at times Albert himself, who in 1952 claimed that, "I have never worked in the field of applied science, let alone for the military. I condemn the military mentality of our time just as you do. Indeed, I have been a pacifist all my life and regard Gandhi as the only true great political figure of our age." As the Manhattan Project neared completion of the atom bomb, Einstein again sounded an alarm that the politicians do not appreciate the possibilities and consequently do not know the extent of the menace. To be sure, we have no idea what tipped the physicists off. It could have been a hunch. It might have been a slip of the tongue by one of his friends working on the project, or it may have just been intuition. At the time of his plea, Germany had been beaten back, making it clear to everyone that it was only a matter of time before their defeat. While he likely would have been okay with dropping the bomb on the people who had democratically elected Hitler, willingly gone along with the Holocaust, and celebrated the plunging of Europe into darkness, he likely wouldn't have supported the use of such a weapon upon Japan. He had traveled twice to Japan and fallen in love with its culture and its people. The Japan that he had visited, however, wasn't the one that had launched a surprise attack upon Pearl Harbor. The godlike personality cult of the emperor had transformed the land of the rising sun into something unrecognizable to the physicists. In both instances, his personal experiences with Germany and Japan clouded his judgment. When his plea for restraint fell on deaf ears in America, he used his famous name to connect his friend Bohr to Winston Churchill in order to push the fact that scientists needed to be involved in the decision-making process, particularly in sharing their findings related to any new weaponry with the Allied Russians. Professor Bohr was soon blacklisted from anything related to the Manhattan Project. He then persuaded Einstein to give up speaking out against what he suspected was coming. Clark tells us that here, as on previous occasions, Einstein had stepped into a dark arena and been tripped by his own ignorance of what was going on. His freedom of action, already limited by lack of official knowledge about the Manhattan Project, was now further hampered by what he had been told only in confidence. For practical purposes, they also made it more difficult for Einstein to make his voice heard in any discussion which might be raised about use of the bomb in the Pacific or even in Europe. Other scientists within Los Alamos were struggling against the same political obstacles, desiring some degree of influence over the politicians who would make the final decision regarding the beginning of the atomic age. America succeeded where Germany failed because of a number of factors. At the early stage of the conflict, the Nazis' military apparatus had been so effective that it hadn't needed to invest in the long-term planning which was required to build the bomb. In the later stages of the war, particularly after D-Day, their military resources were stretched too thin to carry out large-scale scientific research that might never produce anything tangible. Even if they had taken the same actions, they would have been desperately short of the scientific minds that found themselves collaborating in Los Alamos due to their purges of Germany's Jewish scientific minds. Heisenberg, the man most in charge of the German H-bomb efforts, told reporters after the war that whatever one may think about motives, it remains a fact that a serious attempt to produce atom bombs in Germany was not undertaken. Although in principle, but perhaps not in practice, the path to it had been open since 1942. Germany eventually collapsed within itself, surrendering on May 7, 1945, following Hitler's suicide on April 30th. Oppenheimer successfully detonated the world's first atomic bomb 2 months later on July 16th. They had been faster than the Germans at developing nuclear weapons, but not quick enough to utilize them against the Nazis. Amidst these earth-shaking events in the spring of 1945, Dr. Szilard broke protocol and visited Albert Einstein at Princeton. He was almost assuredly followed by agents working to maintain the secrecy of the Manhattan Project. After speaking at some length, Einstein sent a letter to Roosevelt in an attempt to get him to listen to the scientist's concerns. A snippet of the correspondence reveals the reading between the lines that was necessary due to the fact that Einstein had never received his security clearance. It reads, "The terms of secrecy under which Dr. Szilard is working at present do not permit him to give me information about his work. However, I understand that he now is greatly concerned about the lack of adequate contact between scientists who are doing this work and those members of your cabinet who are responsible for formulating policy." Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president who Einstein had urged to take up the Herculean task of his time, passed away after suffering a cerebral hemorrhage while sitting for a portrait on April 12th, 2 weeks after Einstein had attempted to influence the president, and 18 days before Hitler tested cyanide upon his pet dog before shooting his wife Eva Braun within their shared bunker. FDR had been on his unprecedented 4th term as American president, a practice now outlawed by the Constitution. When Harry Truman took over, the bureaucratic compartmentalization had been so great that FDR's understudy knew nothing of what was happening in Los Alamos when he became America's 33rd president. Truman made the fateful call to annihilate the city of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. History teachers love to debate the dropping of the atomic bomb. Personally, I believe that the first bomb was likely necessary. The previous invasion of Okinawa on March 26 was absolutely devastating. 16,000 American servicemen were killed, while local authorities claimed that at least 149,425 Okinawan residents perished. The so-called Die for the Emperor campaign had commenced, and American soldiers were forced to shoot women who had grabbed kitchen knives before charging them in a kamikaze-styled attack. The Chicago Tribune did a long-form article on the Battle of Okinawa in 1995, telling us of just some of the horrors witnessed. The reporter states that a week before the main battle began, a U.S. raiding party landed on the island and destroyed submarines that were set to carry out suicide attacks against U.S. ships. The 300 Japanese troops retreated to the hills, but not before screaming at the 1,000 civilians in the local villages that they would be raped and brutally murdered by the advancing Americans. They handed out 2 hand grenades to each head of the household and told them to use one on the Americans and the other on their families. Kinjo, a 16-year-old boy who survived the battle, recalls seeing a man break off a tree branch in order to beat his wife and children to death. In a panic, the survivor recounts everyone started to do it. Rocks, strangulation by rope. The Tribune reveals to us that the battle toll on the U.S. Navy was horrendous. About 4,000 kamikaze sorties sank 33 ships and damaged 368 others. In the most disastrous incident, 724 sailors on the carrier USS Franklin died during a raid. U.S. deaths at sea, more than 8,000, outnumbered the fatalities on land, which progressed bunker by bunker, hill by hill, with the U.S. soldiers resorting to frontal assaults, flanking maneuvers, and flamethrowers to flush the entrenched Japanese out of the caves that were impervious to artillery bombardment. The Americans had delivered to Okinawa a typhoon of steel and bombs, but they deeply felt the severe effects of a people defending their homeland against an outside force which had been demonized by their respected leaders. The bigger the blast radius, the more innocents are caught up as collateral damage, and nothing could produce the destructive power of the atomic bomb. Yet after Okinawa, policymakers could plausibly argue that if mainland Japan's civilians reacted in a similar manner, that they weren't non-combatants, and therefore legitimate military targets. Truthfully, the leading men of the Pentagon probably didn't even go through those mental gymnastics, as they had already firebombed multiple Japanese cities, including Tokyo. The dropping of the first atomic bomb was to show the Japanese that we are capable of delivering a device that could take out a city all by itself. The second bomb was to prove that we were willing to keep doing it until Japan surrendered. I'm not sure that 3 days were long enough for the Japanese to comprehend the level of carnage that had been wrought upon Hiroshima. When the emperor refused to accept the terms of unconditional surrender, America dropped the plutonium implosion version of the bomb, nicknamed Fat Man, upon the doomed city of Nagasaki. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists tells us that neither of the airplanes that delivered the bombs observed the attack, nor those on the ground experiencing it could get more than a qualitative sense of the destruction in the immediate aftermath. The smoke, fires, and carnage were too great. Observational aircraft tried in vain to photograph the damage later in the day, but the city was too obscured by smoke to accurately assess. On the ground, eyewitnesses were largely unaware that it had been a single attack, and a consistency across accounts is their shock at realizing that the entire city had been affected all at once by a single plane. The American announcement of the successful detonation of the bomb was released 16 hours later. Einstein was on vacation when he heard the news via the president's radio address. The New York Times were the first to elicit a statement from the German scientists which simply read, "The world is not yet ready for it." Later, upon seeing images of the destructive nature that E equals MC squared had unwittingly wrought upon humanity, he would proclaim, "I know not what weapons World War III will be fought with, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones." The damage was stunning to everyone involved. Oppenheimer had estimated that 20,000 would die if the bombs were used within a major city. Unofficial American sources were estimating that perhaps the number of dead and wounded might exceed 100,000. That insane number halted further attacks, with Truman proclaiming to his cabinet that the thought of wiping out another 100,000 people was too horrible. Accurate measurements of the destruction continues to elude authorities. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists recommends that teachers use the phrasing that between 70,000 and 140,000 people died at Hiroshima, with Nagasaki suffering roughly half as much due to geographical differences between it and its sister city. Clark tells us that later, as the background to the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki began to be known, Einstein supported those scientists who claimed that the bomb should not have been used. He agreed that force had to be met by force, and he supported the Allied bombing of German civilians as morally justified. Yet he believed that justification could be stretched only to cover the minimum force necessary to achieve desired moral ends. On the facts available, this did not include the Japanese bombings. Although he did everything that he could to create distance between himself and the weapons that were used to end World War II, Albert Einstein remains forever associated with nuclear weapons. As people began to refer to him as the father of the bomb, he went on the offensive, telling his side of the story to The Atlantic for its November 1945 issue. He tells the audience that, "I do not believe that civilization will be wiped out in a war fought with the atomic bomb. Perhaps 2/3 of the people of the earth might be killed, but enough men capable of thinking and enough books would be left to start again, and civilization could be restored." That optimistic outlook for the survival of 1/3 of humanity likely didn't comfort anyone. Thus, the physicist reveals his hope that the fact that the only 3 nations which remained as great powers, the US, the Soviet Union, and Great Britain, ought to establish a world government, one which would control the atomic weapon in order to ensure that no portion of the world would ever attempt to annihilate another. He still had hopes that the atomic bomb could inspire a long peace, rather than a Cold War. Even geniuses get it wrong from time to time. Join us for our next episode as we explore the final decade of Albert Einstein's life, during which he attempts to find the answer for his long sought-after unified field theory, takes further steps on the behalf of the establishment of a unified world government, and nearly becomes president of Israel. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to interact with the show, you can email us at resourcesbylowery@gmail.com or contact EmpiresPod on Bluesky. If you would like to financially support the show, please look in the description for more information. As always, thank you for listening, rating the show, and spreading the word.